Have you ever wondered how a single man managed to shape the destiny of Rome and, at the same time, seal his own downfall? Julius Caesar was not just a leader. He was a force who defied the rules, faced betrayal, and transformed the Republic into a stage for his greatness, but also for his tragedy. In this video, we will unveil the shocking truth you need to know about the life of Julius Caesar, his meteoric rise, the secrets that made him the most powerful man in Rome, and the mistakes that led to his tragic end. Get ready to discover not only the story, but lessons that still resonate in our own lives about ambition, power, and the high costs of achieving everything you want. If you feel that sometimes the world seems unfair, that great achievements come with immense sacrifices, then stay with me because this is the story of Julius Caesar like you have never heard before. Before we start, tell me, have you subscribed to the channel yet? Because this is just the first in an epic series about the Roman world, full of details and curiosities that you won't want to miss. Imagine a young man born into one of the most influential families in Rome, surrounded by luxury, power, and opportunities. This young man was Marcus Licinius Crassus, who came into the world at a time when Rome was a political and military battlefield. His childhood was marked by classes in rhetoric, philosophy, and strategy, something reserved only for the elite. Crassus grew up hearing stories of the conquests and glories of his lineage, believing that he was destined to maintain the family's prestige. But Crassus's life would not be a straight line of privileges and achievements. His adolescence was abruptly shaken by the storm of civil wars between Marius and Sulla, two giants who fought for control of the Roman Republic. During this period, family loyalties could be a blessing or a curse, and for Crassus, they spelled doom. The Licinios' house, once a symbol of power, was looted and destroyed by Mario's forces, who sought to eliminate any trace of their political rivals. Crassus watched helplessly as everything he knew was destroyed. His family was forced to flee, leaving behind wealth, property, and status. It was as if the foundations of his life had collapsed in a single blow. However, even in the face of this devastating scenario, Crassus did not allow himself to succumb. He had something that Mario's forces could not steal: his ambition, intelligence, and determination. When Sulla's forces finally regained control of Rome, Crassus saw an opportunity where others saw only chaos. He understood that, amid the ashes of the devastated city, lay the secret to rebuilding his fortune. Instead of mourning his losses, Crassus dove into the real estate market, buying destroyed properties at rock-bottom prices. He used persuasion, strategy, and sometimes even intimidation to acquire these lands. Over time, he rebuilt these buildings and turned them into extremely profitable assets. But what really set him apart was his vision. He not only bought land, but also created a network of influence by helping families who had lost everything get back on their feet, of course, in exchange for future loyalty. While others saw only ruins, Crassus saw possibilities. He organized teams of workers to rebuild the properties and later even financed private fire brigades. Cunningly, he approached homeowners whose homes were on fire, offering to buy them at ridiculously low prices before they were completely destroyed. Thus, his wealth began to grow exponentially, along with his reputation as a practical, although not always ethical man. This ability to turn destruction into opportunity made Crassus a feared and admired name in Rome. He had learned the greatest lesson of his youth. Power was not just in keeping what you had, but in knowing how to rebuild when everything seemed lost. Thus, from the ashes of war, Marcus Licinius Crassus raised not only his fortune, but also the foundation for the man who would become one of the richest and most influential in the entire history of Rome. Marco Licinio Crasso knew that, in times of chaos, there were opportunities for those who dared to act. When the civil war between Marius and Sulla reached its peak, Crassus, still young, saw the chance to step out of the shadow of his family ruin and project himself as a man of influence and resources. He chose the side of Sulla, the skilled general and politician who had a clear objective: to retake Rome and establish his authority over the Republic. Sulla was ruthless, but knew how to recognize talent and loyalty. Crassus, determined to prove his worth, offered not only military support, but also his ability to navigate the uncertain terrains of power and negotiation. He used his small, reconstructed fortune, and his strategic intelligence to form a private army that could complement Sulla's forces. This was a risky move to bet all your chips on a man who could be defeated. But Crassus was ambitious and understood that great risks brought great rewards. When Sulla marched on Rome, Crassus was at his side, not just as a commander but as an indispensable ally. During the campaign, Crassus stood out for his boldness. He led his troops with a mix of courage and cold calculation, understanding that his loyalty needed to be demonstrated on the battlefield. In one of the most intense battles, it was his decisive leadership that secured victory on a weakened flank, earning the respect of Sulla and his men. With Sulla finally in control of Rome came what Crassus had most hoped for: the opportunity to grow in the vacuum left by the war. Sulla began his infamous proscriptions, a list of political enemies sentenced to exile or death. Crassus, taking advantage of the chaos, acted quickly. He bought confiscated land from outlawed citizens for ridiculous amounts, further increasing his fortune. In many cases, he used his influence with Sulla to ensure that the best plots were allocated to him. This may seem cruel, but Crassus was a pragmatic man, and in Rome, survival and ambition often went hand in hand. His unwavering loyalty to Sulla not only made him richer but also opened the door to politics. Sulla, grateful for his support, began to introduce Crassus into the circles of power in Rome. He secured Crassus' strategic positions and, more importantly, brought him into contact with other influential men in the Republic. This alliance with Sulla was the first step towards Crassus becoming a central figure on the Roman political scene. But Crassus was not just a follower. He understood that this relationship with Sulla was a bridge to something bigger. At every meeting, at every political banquet, he watched, learned, and made connections. Crassus knew that true power lay not just in accumulated wealth, but in using it to shape lasting alliances. The partnership with Sulla was, without a doubt, a turning point in Crassus' life. He went from a young man who had lost everything to a man whose name was beginning to be whispered with respect and fear in the halls of Roman power. Every step taken alongside Sulla brought him closer to his true goal, becoming one of the most influential men in Rome. And for Crassus, this was just the beginning. Marcus Licinius Crassus did not become the richest man in Rome by chance. His gargantuan fortune was born from a lethal combination of opportunity, ambition, and an unparalleled ability to see value where others saw only chaos. When Rome was immersed in proscription lists of political enemies condemned to death or exile by the dictator Sulla, Crassus realized that here was the chance of a lifetime. For him, it was not just a time of terror. It was the perfect time to grow up. The bans left many Romans desperate. With their names included in Sulla's lists, these people lost everything: lands, houses, businesses. To avoid the worst, many tried to sell their properties for whatever price they could get. This is where Crassus entered the picture, like a patient predator waiting for the right prey. He bought land that was confiscated or sold for such low values that it seemed like a joke. And within a few years, his property portfolio expanded to a level never seen before. But it wasn't just the amount of land that Crassus accumulated. It was what he did with them that made him different. Instead of just leaving them abandoned or reselling them immediately, he invested. Crassus restored properties destroyed by war or neglected by their former owners. He transformed ruined houses into magnificent palaces, abandoned buildings into profitable trading centers, and vacant lots into productive farms. Every piece of land purchased at a bargain price was soon worth 10 times more. Furthermore, Crassus had a unique ability to diversify his investments. He wasn't just a real estate speculator. He organized and financed a team of builders and craftsmen who were always ready to begin new projects. Crassus was also known for a peculiar method. He had his own private fire brigade. When a house caught fire in Rome, something common at the time, Crassus and his men appeared quickly. But instead of putting out the flames immediately, he did. So, did you already know this story about ancient Rome? Tell us in the comments. I want to know what you think. An offer to the owner of the burning house. If the owner agreed to sell the property at a very low price, the fire was put out. Otherwise, Crassus would simply let the fire consume everything. This cruel but efficient method increased his fortune even further. Therefore, Crassus controlled a significant portion of Rome's economy. He had farms, silver mines, entire buildings, and even slave businesses. His wealth was so great that he could lend money to struggling senators and politicians, ensuring his influence at virtually every level of the Roman Republic. To many, he was a financial genius. For others, an unscrupulous opportunist. But everyone agreed on one thing. No one accumulated wealth like Marco Licinio Crasso. The most fascinating thing about Crassus was that his ambition seemed to have no limits. Even though he was the richest man in Rome, he was not satisfied. He wanted more money, more power, more recognition. Wealth, for him, was not an end in itself, but a tool to shape Rome according to his will. Crassus understood that money was the universal language in Rome. He used it to buy allies, influence political decisions, and strengthen his position. It became a name that inspired both awe and fear. When someone in Rome said, Crassus, they weren't just talking about one man. It spoke of a financial empire that had grown from the ashes of a devastated city. His fortune and ambition were so extraordinary that he went down in history as the archetype of immeasurable wealth and relentless ambition. However, for Crassus, there was still something that all the gold in the world couldn't buy, and he was willing to risk everything to achieve it. But that's another part of the story. For now, suffice it to say that at the height of his wealth, Crassus had shaped Rome around him, proving that in times of chaos, ambition is the most powerful weapon of all. Rome was in an uproar. An unprecedented threat shook the Republic, not from foreign enemies or political rivals, but from within its own borders. It was the Spartacus Revolt, the largest slave rebellion that Rome had ever faced. Spartacus, a Thracian gladiator, led an army made up of thousands of slaves who fled their brutal conditions and dreamed of freedom. Not only had they defeated Roman armies, but they had also challenged the very system that sustained Rome's greatness. In this scenario of chaos, a name emerged to restore order: Marco Licinio Crasso. Despite being known for his enormous wealth, Crassus longed for something that money could not buy: military glory and respect as a commander. For Crassus, this rebellion was more than a threat to the Republic. It was his opportunity to show the Senate and people of Rome that he was more than a rich man. He wanted to be remembered as a victorious general. When Crassus took command, he found a demoralized Roman army, which had suffered several defeats at the hands of Spartacus and his followers. Crassus' first measure was to impose strict discipline. He brought back the dreaded punishment of decimation, a method in which 1 in 10 soldiers from failing units was executed, regardless of their individual guilt. This sent a clear message: Crassus would not tolerate weakness or insubordination. Under his command, the Roman army would be forged in fear and loyalty. But Crassus was not just tough, he was also a strategist. Instead of pursuing Spartacus in direct confrontations, as other generals had done and failed, he used the tactic of patience. Crassus knew that the rebel army depended on looting to survive and that it did not have the resources for a prolonged war. He built fortifications to isolate rebellious slaves on the Bruttium Peninsula, blocking their escape routes and supplies. It was a calculated move that showed his skill in siege warfare. Spartacus, however, was no ordinary opponent. He attempted to break the siege several times, leading fierce attacks that tested the Roman lines. In one of these battles, the rebels almost managed to escape, but Crassus, personally leading his troops, managed to contain the advance. His determination on the battlefield inspired his men, even those who feared his relentless leadership. The decisive battle came in 71 BC, when Spartacus, realizing he was cornered, decided to face the Romans in a final confrontation. It was a massacre. Although the slaves fought with desperate courage, they were outnumbered and poorly armed compared to Crassus's well-trained army. Spartacus was killed in combat, and his army was crushed. To send a clear message to the rest of the empire, Crassus ordered 6,000 captured slaves to be crucified along the Appian Way, creating a terrifying image of the price of the revolt against Rome. But despite this monumental victory, Crassus' glory was tarnished by a rival, Pompey. While Crassus eliminated Spartacus' main army, Pompey, returning from Spain, defeated a small group of fleeing rebels. Pompey, ever astute in politics, was quick to claim some of the credit for suppressing the rebellion, winning the applause of the people and the Senate. Crassus, furious, saw his achievement partially overshadowed. Although he was the architect of victory, Pompey knew how to manipulate the narrative to his advantage. This clash of egos between the two men sowed future rivalries, but also an inevitable alliance, as both men shared an insatiable ambition for power. The victory over Spartacus consolidated Crassus' position as one of the most powerful men in Rome, but it also revealed his character. A ruthless man, a brilliant strategist, and willing to do anything to achieve the recognition he so desired. The revolt was crushed, but Crassus' name would remain etched in history as the one who brought the Republic back from chaos, even if his desire for glory was never fully satisfied. In the heart of the Roman Republic, where ambition and power were the forces that moved the destiny of men, three figures came together to shape the future of Rome according to their interests: Marcus Licinius Crassus, Pompey the Great, and Julius Caesar. This alliance, known as the First Triumvirate, was more than a political agreement. It was a pact between three men willing to sacrifice republican traditions in the name of their own goals. It all started at a time of growing tension in Rome. The Republic was torn apart by political rivalries, corruption, and distrust. Crassus, with his vast fortune, wished not only to maintain his influence but to expand it. Pompey, the great general, returned from his victorious campaigns in the East and longed for validation and rewards from the Senate, which was hesitant to grant them. Caesar, still a rising politician, sought to consolidate his popularity with the people and secure the military command that would launch him to glory. These three men, each powerful in their own sphere, understood that alone they would face resistance, but together they would be unbeatable. Crassus brought to the table what no one else could offer: incalculable wealth. He financed campaigns, bought alliances, and secured resources for projects that strengthened the group's power. Pompey, with his fame as Rome's greatest general, had the army and loyalty of veteran soldiers who were ready to fight for him. And Caesar, with his charisma and political skill, was the people's favorite, the bridge between the interests of the elites and the masses. The triumvirate was forged in secret. It was not a formal alliance recognized by the Senate, but a private, almost conspiratorial agreement. The three divided spheres of influence. Crassus would control finances and use his wealth to stabilize and expand the group's power. Pompey would be in charge of maintaining military control and protecting the triumvirate's interests on the battlefield. Caesar, in turn, would use his popularity to influence the decisions of the Senate and popular assemblies. The triumvirate's first major achievement was granting Caesar command in Gaul, a territory where he could lead military campaigns and build his reputation as a general. Crassus, with his ability to negotiate and his wealth, secured the necessary support in the Senate for Caesar to be appointed proconsul. Pompey, although initially reluctant to support Caesar, realized that the alliance was mutually beneficial and contributed to his military influence. While Caesar set out to conquer Gaul, Crassus and Pompey remained in Rome, ensuring that the group's interests were protected. But the alliance was far from perfect. Personal rivalries, especially between Crassus and Pompey, were evident. Crassus viewed Pompey as an arrogant rival, while Pompey considered Crassus greedy and lacking the same military prestige. Still, they both understood that they needed each other, at least for now. Crassus, in turn, sought something that neither his fortune nor the triumvirate had yet given him: military glory comparable to that of Pompey and Caesar. This desire would lead him to a decision that would forever change his trajectory. But for now, he was focused on using his position to solidify the base of the triumvirate and ensure that his influence in Rome remained intact. Before continuing with the story, a quick reminder: have you already liked this video? This helps YouTube spread our content to more Roman history fans like you. It's simple and free. The cost? Now, let's go back to Rome. The triumvirate was a milestone in the history of the Roman Republic. Through this alliance, Crassus, Pompey, and Caesar dominated the politics of Rome, overcoming opposition from the Senate and other ambitious leaders. It was a partnership based on both necessity and ambition, and although powerful, it carried the seeds of its own destruction. But at that moment, for Crassus, Pompey, and Caesar, the future looked bright and control of Rome was in their hands. In the heart of the Roman Republic, where sharp words could be as deadly as swords, Marcus Licinius Crassus built his power base within the Senate. While many of the senators stood out for their military achievements or noble heritages, Crassus brought a different weapon to the political arena: his incomparable wealth. For him, the Senate was not just a place for debate. It was a chessboard where each move needed to be calculated, each alliance strategically formed. From the beginning, Crassus understood that the key to political power was influence, and influence was costly. He used his vast treasury to finance election campaigns for allied senators, pay off debts of prominent figures, and offer generous loans, always with conditions that guaranteed future loyalty. Crassus knew that by helping others achieve their ambitions, he would be paving the way for his own achievements. The Senate, however, was a minefield of inflated egos and long-standing rivalries. Crassus's presence upset many of the traditional aristocrats, who saw his wealth as vulgar and his rise as a sign that times were changing. For many, he was a man who bought his influence, rather than a true leader of the Republic. But Crassus, always astute, never let these criticisms deter him from his objective. One of the most memorable moments of his work in the Senate was his campaign to promote reforms that favored the interests of his class and, of course, himself. He pushed for laws that would facilitate access to land ownership for those who, like him, had acquired property en masse following the bans. These reforms not only strengthened his financial position but also attracted a large number of allies who directly benefited from his vision. But Crassus was also a master at playing counterbalances. He knew that to consolidate his power, he needed to balance the demands of the Senate with the desires of the people. He financed public spectacles, such as gladiatorial games, and sponsored infrastructure works, such as aqueducts and markets, always ensuring that his name was associated with the progress and well-being of the Republic. While his rivals debated in the Senate, Crassus worked to ensure that both plebeians and patricians saw him as an indispensable figure. However, not everything was conquest and applause. The rivalry with Pompey, who also exercised great influence in the Senate, was a constant shadow over Crassus's movements. Pompey, with his reputation as a military hero, had the respect of many senators who saw Crassus as just a power buyer. But Crassus did not back down. He engaged in heated debates, used his rhetorical skill to disarm opponents, and, when necessary, his gold coins to ensure that the scales always tipped in his favor. This dance of alliances and conflicts was, for Crassus, a constant battle. He knew that in Rome, staying at the top was as challenging as getting there. Every reform he promoted, every speech he made, was calculated to strengthen his position and prepare the ground for his next ambitions. He didn't just play the power game, he rewrote it in his favor. The Senate was, for Crassus, both a stage and a battlefield. And while others sought to simply survive in this hostile environment, Crassus thrived. He understood that, in the Roman power game, it was not enough to be strong or rich. You had to be the most cunning, the most resilient, and the most ambitious. And, in this aspect, few could compete with Marco Licinio Crasso. In the vast setting of the Roman Republic, where the most ambitious men fought for power and prestige, the relationship between Marcus Licinius Crassus and Pompey the Great was like a volcano about to erupt. Despite working together in political alliances as the first triumvirate, the rivalry between them was palpable. It was a silent but no less fierce competition, marked by tensions that shaped Roman politics in profound ways. Crassus and Pompey could not be more different. Crassus, a man who rose from the ashes of civil war with intelligence and unparalleled fortune, believed that power came from wealth and skillful manipulation. Pompey, on the other hand, built his reputation on the battlefield, collecting victories that made him the Great, a title he wore with pride. For Crassus, Pompey was an arrogant general who took credit for other people's achievements. For Pompey, Crassus was a rich man, but without the same military brilliance that he believed was essential to true Roman glory. The competition began to take shape when both began to compete for public recognition. After the revolt of Spartacus, which Crassus had crushed with his strategy and leadership, Pompey returned from his campaigns in Hispania and quickly claimed some of the credit for the victory against the rebellious slaves. This infuriated Crassus, who considered this appropriation of merits a personal affront. Still, he swallowed his pride but didn't forget. The rivalry intensified within the Senate, where both sought to consolidate power. Crassus, with his fortune, financed senators and projects to gain allies. Pompey, in turn, used his military prestige to influence decisions. When Pompey pushed for land for his war veterans, Crassus saw an opportunity to challenge his rival, blocking the proposals in the Senate and forcing Pompey to seek popular support. It was a game of cat and mouse, where each person tried to outdo the other. Despite the tensions, the two men realized that they needed each other to achieve their goals. The first triumvirate was a pact of convenience, and even within this alliance, rivalry persisted. Crassus viewed Pompey's growing prestige with the people with suspicion, while Pompey despised the way Crassus used his wealth to buy influence. This competition shaped his political decisions in subtle but profound ways. Crassus, in his quest for glory, financed ambitious projects and sponsored popular campaigns, trying to win the respect that Pompey received more naturally. Pompey, in turn, worked to ensure that his image as a military hero was untouchable, often publicly belittling Crassus to assert his superiority. The peak of this rivalry occurred when Crassus decided to pursue something that could finally rival Pompey's military conquests: a campaign in the east against the Parthians. He wanted to prove that he could also be a great general, worthy of the same reverence that Pompey and Caesar received. But this decision, motivated by both ambition and envy, would end up having tragic consequences. The relationship between Crassus and Pompey was more than a personal dispute. It was a reflection of tensions within the Roman Republic itself. As they worked together, their conflicting ambitions created an unstable dynamic that would eventually contribute to the collapse of the Republican system. But until the end, the competition between them served as fuel for their actions, pushing them to seek greatness, even if it meant destroying whatever stood in their way. In the heart of the Roman Republic, the triumvirate of Crassus, Pompey, and Julius Caesar began to expand its reach, seeking to consolidate dominance over Rome and its provinces. In this power game, Marco Licinio Crasso played a fundamental role. He was the financier, the man behind the gold that supported the group's ambitions. And it was with this economic power that Crassus decided to support Caesar in his campaign in Gaul, a decision that would transform both the triumvirate and the history of Rome itself. Julius Caesar was a man with vision and charisma, but his rise depended on something he didn't have in abundance: financial resources. When Caesar took command of Gaul, he found a golden opportunity to build his military and political legacy. However, wars are not cheap, and Caesar needed more than soldiers. He needed money to feed, arm, and pay his men. This is where Crassus came into the picture. For Crassus, financing Caesar was more than a demonstration of loyalty to the triumvirate. He saw the campaign in Gaul as a strategic opportunity. Caesar's every victory strengthened the triumvirate, but it also consolidated Crassus' own power behind the scenes. With every bag of coins sent to Caesar, Crassus ensured that his influence remained indispensable. Caesar's battles in Gaul were grandiose, facing tribes such as the Helvetii, the Belgians, and, finally, the powerful Vercingetorix. The narrative of these campaigns, marked by strategy and courage, echoed in Rome, increasing Caesar's popularity. But few knew that behind each victory was Crassus's financial support. It provided the money needed to pay the soldiers and support the logistical costs of such a vast campaign. This relationship was mutually beneficial. Caesar won victories and glory, while Crassus ensured that the triumvirate remained stable and that its influence grew. He knew that a subdued Gaul would not only bring riches to Rome but also put Caesar in a position of strength, something essential to balancing the relationship between the three leaders. However, Crassus' support for Caesar was also a political move. He understood that strengthening Caesar could be a way to balance Pompey's growing power. While Pompey dominated Rome with his troops and military prestige, Caesar in Gaul represented a counterweight that held the triumvirate together. For Crassus, maintaining this balance was crucial so that neither of the two allies became strong enough to threaten him. The impact of Caesar's campaign in Gaul was immense. He not only conquered territories, but also built a military power base that would challenge the Roman Senate itself. And while Caesar wrote his history in battle, Crassus continued to move the pieces on the political chessboard. ensuring that Caesar's rise also solidified his own position. The alliance between Crassus and Caesar in Gaul showed the complexity of the triumvirate. It was a partnership of interests, where each person sought to strengthen their position without ever losing sight of their own objectives. And although Crassus's support was essential to Caesar's campaigns, he also knew that this investment was part of a larger game, a game he was determined to win. Thus, with each battle Caesar won, Crassus consolidated his role as the invisible architect of the triumvirate's success. The campaign in Gaul was not just a military victory. It was a testament to the ambition and strategy of Crassus, the man who understood that, in Rome, power came as much from the battlefield as from the weight of gold. Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome, possessed something that not even his immense fortune could satisfy: the burning desire for military glory. He had wealth, political power, and a strategic position in the triumvirate, but there was a shadow that constantly followed him. While Julius Caesar achieved fame in Gaul and Pompey was already celebrated as the greatest general of his time, Crassus yearned for a great feat that would engrave his name in history alongside the great conquerors. And it was in the East, in the campaign against Parthia, that he saw the opportunity to become a legend, a worthy rival to Alexander the Great. The East has always held a special fascination for the Romans. It was a land of fabulous riches, full of myths and stories of conquest. More importantly, it was where Alexander the Great had built his empire, leaving a legacy that still dominated the imagination of Rome's most ambitious men. For Crassus, defeating Parthia, a powerful kingdom that controlled the trade routes between West and East, would be more than a military victory. It would be a way to surpass Alexander's glory and eclipse the achievements of his rivals in Rome. Crassus used all his influence in the Senate to secure the military command necessary for his campaign. He promised untold riches to the Roman treasury, playing on his fellow senators' desire for expansion. But deep down, this was not just a political mission. It was personal. Crassus wanted something that neither his gold coins nor his political alliances could buy: respect and historical immortality. In 53 BC, Crassus left for the East, leading an army of around 40,000 soldiers, including the elite of the Roman legions. He was confident, almost arrogant, believing that his military strength would crush the Parthians with ease. However, Parthia was no common enemy. The Parthians had an agile army, composed mainly of mounted archers and heavy cavalry, the famous cataphractories. These warriors were trained to fight on vast plains, where they could use their mobility and tactics to confuse and destroy heavier armies, such as the Romans. Crassus' march was marked by questionable decisions. He ignored advice from local allies and underestimated the terrain, advancing through arid and poorly supplied regions. His desire for glory blinded him to the dangers ahead. When he finally encountered the Parthian army at Charis, present-day Harran, Turkey, he realized that he had seriously underestimated his enemy. The Battle of Charis was a monumental disaster. The Parthian archers, mounted on fast horses, used a devastating tactic. They surrounded the Romans and bombarded them with incessant arrows, staying out of reach of the legions. The heavy force of the Romans, trained for hand-to-hand combat, became useless in the face of this approach. Crassus' confidence turned to despair as his men were decimated. Scorching heat, lack of supplies, and disorganization completed the disaster. In the end, Crassus was betrayed by allied leaders who offered sham negotiations with the Parthians. He was captured and humiliatingly killed, marking the tragic end of his campaign. It is said that, in a symbolic act of mockery, the Parthians poured molten gold down his throat, representing his insatiable ambition for wealth and power. Crassus' death at Charis was not only a personal defeat, but also a blow to the triumvirate. His absence destabilized the political balance between Pompey and Caesar, contributing to the collapse that would lead to civil war in Rome. Crassus's dream of rivaling Alexander the Great ended in tragedy, but his story remains a reminder of the price of unbridled ambition. He wanted more than riches. "I wanted eternity." And, in a way, he achieved it not as the great conqueror he wanted to be, but as one of the greatest examples of the consequences of underestimating the dangers of too grand a dream. In 53 BC, Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome, was ready to leave his definitive mark on history. He had it all: untold wealth, political influence, and a place in the powerful triumvirate alongside Julius Caesar and Pompey. But something he desperately wanted was missing: military glory. And it was this insatiable quest for fame and recognition that led him to embark on a campaign against Parthia, one of the greatest powers in the East. From the beginning, Crassus's campaign was marked by arrogance. He believed that the Roman army, considered invincible, would crush the Parthians with ease. Parthia in What did you think of the story? Was there a character or detail that impressed you the most? Share in the comments. I want to hear your ideas. However, it was not just any force. His army was unlike anything the Romans had faced before, consisting of extremely skilled mounted archers and heavy cavalry equipped with armor that glittered in the sun like gold. But Crassus did not take this into account. He was convinced that his political experience and the numbers of his legions would be sufficient to ensure victory. The march began with an imposing force of around 40,000 men, including some of Rome's finest legions. Crassus crossed into Syria, where he began preparing for the invasion of Parthia. He rejected the advice of local allies, who warned him about the Parthian-friendly tactics and terrain. Ignoring these warnings, Crassus insisted on advancing directly into the heart of enemy territory, trusting that his reputation and the numbers of his troops would intimidate the enemy. But Parthian territory was not friendly. It was a land of vast arid plains, where the scorching heat and lack of water soon began to affect the morale and endurance of its soldiers. Crassus, however, pressed on, increasingly obsessed with the idea of achieving a glorious victory. When he finally encountered the Parthian army near the city of Caris, he expected a traditional battle, with rows of soldiers facing each other directly. But what he found was something completely different. The Parthians, led by General Surina, were masters of mobile warfare. Using mounted archers, they adopted a devastating tactic. They surrounded the Roman legions and bombarded them with incessant arrows, staying out of range of the Roman weapons. The sound of arrows, whistling through the air like warnings of death, echoed across the battlefield as the Romans, unable to fight back, were slaughtered en masse. Roman discipline, known for turning battles into victories, began to crumble in the face of an enemy that never got close enough to be confronted. Crassus made an even more serious error when he ordered his cavalry to advance to break the siege. Led by his son Publius, the cavalry was drawn away from the main army and surrounded by Parthian archers. The Romans were massacred, and Publius himself died in combat. When his son's head was displayed by the Parthians on a spear, Crassus lost control of the situation. What was once a campaign for glory turned into a personal nightmare. Desperate, Crassus tried to negotiate with the Parthians, but was betrayed during the conversations. He was captured and humiliatingly killed, putting an end to one of the most disastrous campaigns in Roman history. It is said that the Parthians, mocking his greed, poured molten gold into his mouth after his death, a cruel symbol of how his ambition had destroyed him. The defeat at Caris was a monumental disaster for Rome. More than 20,000 Roman soldiers died, another 10,000 were captured, and the legions that had marched so confidently were reduced to ashes in the Parthian desert. Crassus' death also destabilized the balance of the triumvirate, sowing the seeds of the fatal rivalry between Caesar and Pompey that would lead to civil war. The campaign against Parthia is remembered as an example of how arrogance, bad strategy, and disregard for advice can lead to ruin. Crassus, who sought immortal glory, found only disaster. But his story remains a powerful reminder of the price one pays for underestimating an enemy and for the insatiable desire for power. The Battle of Caris in 53 BC was the final point of Marco Licinio Crassus' excessive ambition. He, who had risen to the top of the Roman Republic thanks to his immense fortune and political maneuvers, believed that the campaign against Parthia would be his coronation. But instead, the arid desert of the East witnessed his downfall in one of the most humiliating defeats in Rome's history. It all started with arrogance. Crassus underestimated the Parthians, an enemy he knew little about, but who mastered war tactics completely different from those faced by the Romans. He ignored advice from local allies, who warned him about the strength of the Parthian cavalry and the treacherous vastness of the desert. Instead of listening, Crassus advanced with blind confidence, leading his army into a deadly trap. When the Roman forces arrived at Caris, the Parthian general Surinna had already prepared the ground. He brought with him an agile army, made up of mounted archers and the famous heavy cavalry known as cataphractories. While Crassus imagined a traditional battle, with rows of soldiers facing each other in hand-to-hand combat, Surinna had other plans. He knew the rigidity of Roman formations and knew how to exploit their weaknesses. The combat began with a scene that terrified Crassus' soldiers. The Parthians, mounted on fast horses, fired incessant arrows at the Roman legions. These arrows, launched with deadly precision, caused immense damage. But the real trick was in the strategy. The archers remained in constant movement, retreating and firing, while the Romans, unable to reach them, suffered in silence. It was like fighting a shadow. Crassus tried to maintain order. He ordered his troops to form a defensive square, protecting themselves with shields as they waited for the Parthians to attack directly. But the direct attack never came. The bombardment of arrows continued, uninterrupted. The Romans, accustomed to hand-to-hand combat, were powerless against this guerrilla tactic. The scorching heat and lack of supplies worsened the situation, and morale began to crumble. In a desperate act, Crassus sent his cavalry to break the siege. Led by his son, Publius, the Roman knights advanced bravely, but fell into a trap. The Parthian archers retreated, drawing the cavalry away from the main army, where they were surrounded and massacred. When the Parthians returned to the battlefield, displaying Publius' head on a spear, the Roman army lost any hope of victory. Crassus was devastated, but still tried to save what was left of his troops. He began a disorganized retreat during the night, but his movements were quickly detected by the Parthians. Surrounded and without options, Crassus agreed to negotiate a surrender with Surinna. It was at that moment that the betrayal happened. The local allies, who were supposed to mediate the negotiations, were on the Parthian side. During the encounter, Crassus was captured and brutally executed. Molten gold was said to have been poured down his throat, a final mockery of his fame as the richest man in Rome. The defeat at Caris was devastating. More than 20,000 Roman soldiers were killed, another 10,000 captured, and the legions that marched confidently to the east were obliterated. Rome's reputation for invincibility was shattered, and Parthia emerged as a formidable enemy on the political and military stage. For Rome, Crassus' death meant more than the loss of a general. She destabilized the triumvirate, leaving Pompey and Caesar on a collision course, which would culminate in a civil war. For Crassus, the Battle of Caris marked the tragic end of a life dedicated to the search for power and glory. His name would not be remembered alongside Alexander the Great, as he had dreamed, but as an example of what happens when ambition exceeds the limits of reason. Crassus's fall at Caris was more than a military defeat. It was a bitter lesson that not all fortune or political influence can save a man who underestimates his enemy and overestimates his own capabilities. Marcus Licinius Crassus' ambition took him to the top of Rome, but it was also his downfall. After the devastating defeat at Caris, he found himself in a literal and figurative desert, without victory, without an army, and surrounded by enemies. For a man who had built his life on the certainty that power and wealth could solve any problem, this was the moment of greatest humiliation. And yet, the worst was yet to come. After the battle, Crassus tried to negotiate his survival. Accompanied by a handful of exhausted and demoralized soldiers, he was forced to accept a meeting with Surinna, the brilliant Parthian general who had orchestrated his defeat. Crassus believed he could somehow use his influence and promises of concessions to save himself and the remnants of his army. However, he was ignorant of Surinna's cunning and the anger that his invasion had aroused in the Parthians. When he arrived at the agreed place for negotiations, Crassus was no longer the same man who had left Rome full of confidence. He was dejected, aware that his ambition had brought him to this point. During the meeting, everything seemed to go well until, in an instant, the betrayal became clear. Local allies, who Crassus believed were on his side, handed him over to the Parthians. The Roman general was captured, along with his officers, and taken to the Parthian camp as a prisoner. What happened next became one of the most humiliating scenes in Roman history. Surinna, a man both cruel and theatrical, had a plan to turn Crassus' death into a symbol, a message to the Roman world. Crassus was tied up, exposed before the Parthian army, and his wealth, which was once his greatest weapon, became his death sentence. Legend has it that, to mock his reputation as the richest man in Rome, the Parthians executed Crassus in a cruel and symbolic way. They melted gold and poured the scalding liquid down his throat, as if to say, "Here is your wealth. Now it will be your destruction." Although some historians question the veracity of this story, the account has become part of the myth surrounding Crassus, a man whose greed was, literally, his undoing. Crassus' execution was more than a personal tragedy. It was a blow to Rome. For the Parthians, his death was a political and military victory, a humiliation inflicted on the powerful Roman Empire. For Rome, it was a bitter reminder that even its most powerful men were mortal. News of his death spread like wildfire, shocking senators, generals, and the people. Crassus, who had dominated the political and economic landscape of the Republic, was now an example of the price of excessive ambition. The end of Crassus also marked the collapse of the fragile balance of the triumvirate. Without him, Pompey and Caesar were left alone in a direct competition for control of Rome, which would culminate in a civil war that would change the fate of the Republic forever. Crassus, who had once dreamed of carving his name alongside Alexander the Great, ended up etched in history in another way as a man who lost himself in his quest for more. Crassus' death was not just an execution. It was a spectacle destined to be remembered. And, in fact, even today she reminds us that even the greatest can fall when they let their ambition speak louder than reason. He sought glory and encountered tragedy, but his legacy continues to echo like a warning. Greed can build empires, but it can also destroy them. The death of Marcus Licinius Crassus in 53 BC, it was more than the end of an ambitious man. It was the beginning of a period of chaos that would forever change the history of Rome. The triumvirate, the alliance that united Crassus, Pompey, and Julius Caesar, had been built on three pillars: Crassus' wealth, Pompey's military prestige, and Caesar's popularity. With the fall of one of these pillars, the carefully maintained balance began to crumble, and the Republic entered a cycle of rivalries that would culminate in civil war. Crassus always played a crucial role as an informal mediator between Pompey and Caesar. Although there was constant tension between the two, his presence helped balance their conflicting ambitions. He kept Pompey in check with his influence in the Senate and strengthened Caesar with his wealth and strategic support. But when Crassus fell on the sands of Carus, this delicate balance was destroyed. Without him, rivalries that were latent began to grow, and tensions that were previously hushed up came to the surface. Pompey, now without an immediate counterweight, began to consolidate his position in Rome. He was already seen as the defender of the Republic due to his military victories and his proximity to the Senate. After Crassus' death, Pompey took the opportunity to strengthen his alliance with the senatorial elite, becoming an even more powerful figure in Rome. To many, he seemed like the natural leader who could stabilize the Republic in times of uncertainty. However, this rise further fueled Julius Caesar's distrust. While Pompey dominated Rome, Caesar was in Gaul, cementing his reputation as one of the greatest generals of his time. Caesar's campaigns in Gaul not only expanded Roman territory, but also created an army loyal to him, made up of soldiers who idolized him. Caesar was a hero to the masses, but to the Senate and especially Pompey, he was becoming a growing threat. Crassus' death meant that there was no one left to moderate the relationship between the two, and the competition for power began to intensify. The conflict reached a critical point when the Senate, under Pompey's influence, ordered Caesar to disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen. Caesar, who knew Pompey's political moves, interpreted this as an attempt to neutralize him and decided to act. In 49 BC, he crossed the Rubicon River with his troops, an action considered an act of war against Rome. Alia iacta est, the die is cast, were Caesar's words as he crossed the Rubicon. marking the beginning of the civil war that would plunge Rome into a new chapter of its history. Crassus' death was not just a personal tragedy or military setback. It was a catalyst for the collapse of an already fragile political system. Without their wealth to finance alliances and without their presence to balance the egos of Pompey and Caesar, the triumvirate collapsed. Crassus's dream of eternal glory ended in his humiliating defeat at Carus, but the impact of his absence resonated in Rome for decades. The Republic, already weakened by internal divisions, found itself unable to contain the ambitions of two of the most powerful men in its history. Pompey and Caesar were now on a collision course, and what was once a pragmatic alliance turned into a struggle for total control of Rome. Crassus' death was the event that destabilized the triumvirate, paving the way for a period of conflict that would culminate in the fall of the Republic and the birth of the Roman Empire. Thus, Crassus's legacy lived on, not in the glory he so sought, but in the consequences of his absence. His desire for greatness led to his downfall, but his death left a void that changed the destiny of Rome forever. Marcus Licinius Crassus is remembered in history as one of the richest men Rome has ever seen, but his life was much more than a simple display of wealth. His journey, marked by inordinate ambition, strategic genius, and, ultimately, humiliating disaster, became a lasting lesson in the price of always striving for more, even when you have everything. From a young age, Crassus showed a unique ability to transform crises into opportunities. He was a survivor, a man who saw his family and fortune destroyed during the civil wars of Marius and Sulla, but who used his cunning and determination to rebuild what he had lost. During this time, he learned to see value where others saw literal ruins. Buying properties from outcast citizens for ridiculous prices, he rebuilt his fortune with impressive speed, transforming himself into the real estate tycoon of ancient Rome. However, for Crassus, wealth was never enough. He wanted to be remembered not only as the richest man in Rome, but also as one of the most powerful. His alliance with Pompey and Caesar in the triumvirate was a reflection of this ambition. He used his gold to finance military campaigns, sponsor public works, and gain political influence. But despite everything he achieved, he was unable to satisfy his desire for recognition equal to that of his two partners. This desire led him to his boldest and most fatal decision, the campaign against Parthia. Crassus sought not only to conquer territory, but also his place in history as a general worthy of being compared to Alexander the Great. He wanted to prove that his glory came not only from his wealth, but also from his ability to lead and conquer. However, his arrogance and unpreparedness led to his humiliating defeat at Carus, a disaster that not only ended his life, but also altered the course of the Roman Republic. Crassus' death left a power vacuum that destabilized the triumvirate, putting Pompey and Caesar on a collision course. Thus, his legacy was twofold. He was both the architect of his own success and the unwitting agent of its destruction and, by extension, of the Republic he helped shape. Without Crassus to balance the forces, the Republic collapsed, and Rome entered a cycle of civil wars that would culminate in the rise of the empire. Today, Crassus is remembered as a man of contrasts. On the one hand, he was brilliant, a financial strategist who understood how money could be used to accumulate power. On the other, he was blind in his ambition, unable to recognize the limits of his own ability. His story teaches us that, in Rome, success was not just a matter of achievement, but also of knowing when to stop. Crassus' legacy is both fascinating and tragic. He was a man who managed to turn ashes into gold, but who also allowed that gold to consume him. His life is a powerful reminder that ambition, when left unchecked, can be both a ladder to glory and a path to ruin. And although he fell in humiliating fashion, Crassus achieved something few have, being remembered. Not as he wished, but as one of the greatest examples of the power and danger of human ambition. Marcus Licinius Crassus and Julius Caesar, two men so different in origin and style, but united by an alliance that would change the destiny of Rome. When Crassus, the richest man in Rome, decided to support Caesar, the ambitious young politician, he was not just financing campaigns or buying influence, he was paving the way for Rome's transformation from a conflict-ridden republic to a powerful empire. The relationship between Crassus and Caesar began as a partnership of convenience. Caesar, although charismatic and popular, was in debt and desperately needed financial support to advance his political career. Crassus, on the other hand, saw in Caesar a promising ally, someone who could balance his rivalry with Pompey and at the same time strengthen his own political position. This partnership became one of the key elements that solidified the triumvirate. Crassus's support was not just financial. Although his gold played a key role, he also provided Caesar with political connections and a shield of sorts against the more conservative lordly factions. When Caesar took command in Gaul, it was Crassus' money that financed part of his military campaigns, allowing Caesar to maintain a well-equipped and faithful army. With each victory in Gaul, Caesar not only conquered territories for Rome, but also accumulated prestige and a personal power base that he would never have achieved without Crassus's initial support. Crassus's influence on Caesar was also reflected in his pragmatism. Crassus, always focused on results, taught Caesar the importance of balancing ambition with strategy, something that Caesar would apply masterfully in his own campaigns and in the Roman political landscape. This connection shaped Caesar into a more calculating leader, someone capable of navigating both the battlefield and the halls of the Senate. However, the death of Crassus in 53 BC marked a turning point. Without Crassus to mediate the balance of power in the triumvirate, Pompey and Caesar were left to face each other. But ironically, it was Crassus's absence that propelled Caesar to accelerate his rise. Without the richest man in Rome to limit his ambitions, Caesar became bolder, crossing the Rubicon in 49 BC and declaring war on Pompey and the Senate. Crassus' connection to the rise of Caesar is undeniable. Their early support allowed Caesar to establish the foundations of his power. More than that, Crassus's absence opened space for Caesar to emerge as Rome's dominant figure, transforming the chaos left by his former ally's death into a golden opportunity to consolidate his position. Crassus's influence, therefore, goes beyond his own life. He did not live to see the Republic fall, but his role was instrumental in creating the conditions that led to its transformation into an empire. Caesar, who started out as a young politician in debt supported by Crassus, became the absolute leader of Rome and paved the way for the emergence of the empire under Augustus. Crassus's legacy in relation to Caesar is a fascinating reminder of how alliances can shape history. As Crassus sought glory and power, he inadvertently laid the foundation for something much greater than himself: the rise of an empire that would dominate the world for centuries. His ambition financed not only campaigns but also the birth of a new era. And so the story of Crassus and Caesar is not just a story of politics and power, but the narrative of how one man's dreams can pave the way for another's greatness. Thanks for watching this far. Have you already subscribed to the channel? Don't forget, because there are many more incredible Roman stories to come. See you in the next video.